Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How are you guys doing tonight? Welcome to HeartMind Expressions, Fab 4. Maria is going to be unable to come today, and so we are going to pick up the slack where we need to. I'm here joined with Dr. Alex Bloom and our lovely Sue McClure.
Hey.
How are you doing?
Hi, guys.
I'm doing awesome. Hey, I'm doing awesome. What about you guys?
Hanging in there with all this craziness. It never ends, does it?
Party harding and wondering why I partied so hard the other day.
What did you do?
Long story. I'm not.
I got the impression you partied hard because you finally got the souffle wise.
Oh, okay. We're starting off really like that. Okay. I think this is going to be an interesting hour of the minds, isn't it?
Always.
But so interesting month, interesting life. Welcome to October.
Yeah,
Red
October the
October.
1st. Yeah.
Red October. The White House turned red on the 1st of October. What does that tell us? Well, if things align, the stars align, we're in for a very interesting month.
That means Strawberry Shortcake gets to visit Joe Biden.
Yes, obviously.
Oh, wrong red. I'm sorry.
Hey, that sounds more politically correct. Maybe, I don't know.
Oh, are we talking of that little cherry symbol on the Pac-Man game? I don't know. I mean, what do I know?
You know what you know, I guess. Anyway.
There you go.
So, what's on the repertoire today? Anything you guys want to talk about particularly?
Well, everyone, we are actually going to do the Karen's episode. We can't talk about all the other stuff, so we are going to talk about Karen. So Alex Billman, did you ever have any experience with a Karen in your lifetime?
I've worked in retail. Karens are my specialty.
So how do you deal with them?
Well, I do the Neville Chamberlain thing, unfortunately. In retail world, you can't actually tell them off, so you have to appease them.
Yeah.
You gotta stroke their ego a little bit enough where they're happy, and then they kind of go on their merry way. I normally don't have too many issues unless they're being exceptionally witchy, I guess would probably be the best word. I would be using the other word that starts with letter B, but right now we're not talking about a female dog, so it doesn't work in this context.
Oh yeah, but female dogs kind of have paper, so there's a little difference.
Very PC of you, Alex.
Yeah.
One more time.
That's very PC of you.
You could tell that I've been smoozing a little bit more than I should be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, obviously.
For service, that's what happens, you know.
Doctor, should we go through the evolution? We kind of talked about a little last night about the evolution of Karen. So you said, part one, kind of the social engineering, and part two, you gotta, look at the certain situations, how they kind of grew by watering them and giving them sunlight, and it wasn't enough, right? Maybe it was fertilizer we gave them.
I'm glad you took notes last night, Sue, because I was hot and on a roll, and it was like catharsis. I got it all out, said everything that I wanted to with my piece of Karen's, and now my mind is blank. So I'm glad you have notes to kind of redirect me. So where did we start off? Where do we want to go first?
Well, you started off with social engineering of Karen, so I guess we might as well hit the timeline.
Yeah.
To me now, I think Karen's went all the way back to caveman days when the wheel was invented and she complained that the damn wheel was not round enough. I think that was the very first Karen.
There you go.
I don't know.
Well, there's actually, it's funny enough is that there's actually a unconfirmed story about where that term was actually used initially.
Oh, go on.
Well, the story goes that the term Karen really became a standardized word because of Trump, surprisingly, of all people. It's going to be one of those weird ones. Apparently, he did not like the second lady very much, Karen Pence. And supposedly, he was aware of the Pence's history in Indiana, and how there are claims about them dealing with the human trafficking and other unsavory things that happen within that. And so the term Karen became a derogatory statement about, hey, I don't like what you're doing. I know what you're doing, but I'm not going to actually say it unless I'm going to tell your name. And so apparently that term started to go into the zeitgeist.
Huh.
And it became a person who is unsatisfied with things and is willing to make a person's life a living misery.
Yeah.
So now we got the guy version called Carl. That's what we came up with. So
Carl.
so,
sounds like something I've heard from, like, was it Almost Wear Hats? I think it was. You guys familiar with that series?
yeah.
No.
So should we talk about, the social engineering of them, Doctor?
Let's do it. So I'm on Urban Dictionary's website right now, trying to see about the etymology of Karen. And it looks like the earliest entry I can find so far, real quickly, there's 194 pages of Karen definition. So I'm scrolling.
Okay, do note this episode's going to be 2 hours long.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But the earliest reference I see is 2018.
Like I said.
That would fit time-wise, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
It kind of fits in that zeitgeist analogy. Wow. Maybe there is some truth to that story. I don't know. I completely unconfirmed. That is something I've heard through the chants and through other sources of info. So there may be some relevance to that, I guess. Maybe. I don't know.
One definition here, it says a middle-aged white woman who drives her kids to sports games in an SUV. One wrong call from the ref, and she'll have them sued. Oh, and she has a bob cut. She absolutely loves talking to the manager about not getting a sauce packet. So, the psychology of Karens, let's start with the history of Karens and move into the psychology. So here's kind of some initial sketchings and thoughts that I have just based on our truth or path and kind of piecemealing together different puzzle pieces to kind of see how all this fits together. And obviously, if you guys have input, I'd love to hear that too. So I think this is going to be no surprise as it fits in with a lot of other divisive tactics that the cabal loves to use of so my conceptualization is like a funnel that we start broad, big picture, and then we kind of funnel down to the individual person themselves. So a lot of this is going to start with kind of those upper echelon think tanks and just this idea of kind of social engineering. So like I was telling Sue last night, a lot of this, I think, stems way, way back. That if we were to kind of have like a sidebar conversation really quick, some of you know this, maybe some of you don't. There was a Mason named Albert Pike in the late 1800s.
Oh, yes, I've heard that name. Yes.
Yeah, he was like the one of the top guys in the Masonic Lodge. And he penned what would become, in his theory, quote unquote, the next 3 world wars that would take place in the 20th century. And the First World War would be with Europe. The Second World War, which would follow that, would be more global and would involve the East. And the Third World War would be between Christians and Muslims.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And this document that was written in like 1880 something actually went on display in a museum up until the 1970s. And then it was taken down. Now, why would something like that be documented, let alone made public? And it's like a lot of the other things that we talk about. It's truth in plain sight, right? So this is kind of how they operate, how they think, that you have to have some exposure to it for karmic reasons so that they feel they can be let off the hook. And so their theories are so outlandish that the average person isn't going to fall for it or believe that there could be any truth to it. That's the cognitive dissonance. So where I'm going with this is that there's forethought planned out decades, if not, longer beforehand. So this is the same in terms of, I'll use just a broad term and I'll say women empowerment. And let me kind of give a caveat before I go into this. I'm all about women's rights. I'm all about women having the same rights as men, et cetera, all of that. What I'm talking about is kind of broader themes, not as it pertains to individuals. So when you start studying this, you realize that almost every single movement that popped up in the past century, let alone beforehand, was pre-scripted. So where this begins as it pertains to women goes way back to 100 years ago with the suffragette movement. So getting women's right to vote, which again, I think is a great thing. I'm not against that. But there is a trajectory. There's always a cover story and a behind the scenes in terms of how these groups of people operate. And on the cover, in order for something to sell, they have to make it sexy. They can't just give poison and have people expect to eat the poison. They have to sugarcoat it. Mm-hmm. And so they do this for everything. Everything. That's their tactic. That's the golden thread in terms of how they operate. So you look at BLM, right? Who wants to be called a racist? Who wants to consider themselves a racist? For that matter, who really is racist in terms of percentage-wise in 2021? That's an archaic form of thought. Yes, it still exists, but it's nowhere near where it used to be. And yet all of this movement that's been put forward has brought this up to the forefront, to the point now, like Sue and I were saying last night, it's gone so wackadoodle that now, Alex, you might have heard about this past week, that now the left wants to create their own American flag for African Americans. And they've pitched up several different versions.
Mm-hmm. I mean, they already within the NFL, they every so often they'll play what's called the Black National Anthem, lift every voice, I believe it's called. Even though if you actually talk to anybody within the Black community, they don't claim that unless you're part of the that mindset.
Yeah. Don't you love it? It's called Every Voice, and yet it's only for the Blacks.
Oh, what's also what if I don't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry about that. But even when it comes to BLM and even going into the suffragettes and the introduction of women's right to vote, mm-hmm. It was actually a very vocal minority. At that time, it was most women actually did not want to have the right to vote, but it was a vocal minority that lobbied DC, and eventually the constitutional amendment was added.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a good point. So, and I'll give another quick example. There is a university somewhere in the Midwest, and the president just came out and said that they will be constructing a second auditorium just for Blacks and just for Black sports. So this has gone so extreme that even those who are, and I love her to death, but my mother, who can be very close-minded about a lot of this stuff, even she is forced to say, whoa, that's too far. And so like, hallelujah, like at what point do we kind of say we can cry foul that we've gone to a breaking point, that it's gone too extreme? Do you know what I mean?
Wasn't the whole point of the civil rights movement to reintegrate people? I mean,
exactly.
Yeah. So what we're doing is an exact 180 of that. Mm-hmm. We're not reintegrating people. We're segregating people again.
Well, and if you follow the BLM doctrine, they're not following Martin Luther King's material. They're going off of Malcolm X, which was a completely different intention and approach of what was to be taken with Black Panthers and violence. And now these BLM leaders are officially recognizing and encouraging people to say, if it's related to this value and intention of not just civil rights, but like your right as an as a Black person, which is kind of interesting of itself. Do you remember the days back in like the 90s when it was un-PC to say Black, that you were forced to say Caucasian or African American? And now it's devolved once again to Black, white, right? So, so with this, it's not about reintegration, like you're saying. This is what made Gandhi's approach so potent in India, or Martin Luther King's approach over here so powerful, that this was the agape type of love that Jesus spoke about. And this was why he was persecuted, because he was making a social movement, just like those other two individuals. So I digress, but my point remains that you have things on the surface and what's underneath. What's underneath is Marxism that's being carried out.
Sorry.
I'll take another example of like socialism is the sugar coating for the poison underneath, which is communism. So that's my point with this, is that you have a cover story and then something else going on underneath. So we'll come back to the women's movement, but I want to, Alex, were you going to say something?
I was going to say that the three leaders of BLM, that I think was last year or early this year, literally went on record saying that they were trained Marxists.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Yep.
So and trained Marxists that took donations and got mansions. I mean, that doesn't sound like Marxism right there. That sounds like capitalism almost. You're going to change a service for goods, and then all of a sudden you make yourself in better standing than you were before.
Democratic socialism. Don't you love it? It's rules for thee, but not for me. Is what it comes down to.
It's as the adage goes, it's just about two wolves arguing over what's for dinner. Eventually, there's not going to be anything left for them to hunt, and eventually they're going to hunt each other.
Yeah,
just because of the scarcity.
Well, they can't even agree on the topping of pizza if you put them in the same room. So
that's politicians for you. But that's what you see, like with the spending.
Oh, very true.
Like you had the Nancy Pelosi Democrats and the extreme progressive Democrats kind of fighting over the spending bill, and is it going to be passed or isn't it? So they're really starting to eat their own. My point with this again is that there's so many examples we can go into of cover story, agenda underneath. So with kind of women's right to vote, that was kind of a starting point. And why did we want to kind of introduce this more from a cabal mindset? It's because there's three things that have to be in place in order for the backbone of America to break and communism to take over. You have to destroy love of country, love of family, and love of God. Those are the three things. Replacing God is Mother Russia, is the government, right? This idea that like you have to give your power and sovereignty away to Big Brother. So you see this in lots of places where communism
is science
taking over. Yeah, exactly. That you this idea of religious institutions, of churches, mosques, synagogues, whatever, that those are illegal, and that you have to kind of pursue your religion in the basement, right? So the family component, that's what they've really started social engineering this past 100 years. You see it in the Black community in the 60s and 70s, where you have to take a strong fatherly figure out of the picture. And so there's lots of different ways in which that carried itself out.
And Disney has not even helped at all. I mean, Disney has constantly put these stories in people's mind that one parent is usually missing, if not both of them. And then you have like an aunt, uncle, or cousin looking after you, if not a grandparent.
And not only that, all you see are matriarchal type figures. You rarely see a strong masculine figure in terms of like a parental role. It's always like a dashing, prince in shining armor or something along those lines. But in terms of like a parental role, they're either broken homes, or it's a mother or a stepmother in charge, or like Sue, what you're saying, an aunt, or something along those lines. That's intentional. That's by design for sure. So anyway, so to keep going here, so you've got kind of the suffragette movement, And then from there, the next real data point is like the 1940s with World War II and Rosie the Riveter, right? All the men are in war. And so the women step up into the workforce and take over. Again, not a bad thing. The point is that they are becoming more independent, which is, there's a trajectory that I'm going here. Then you have the 1950s. A lot of movie and media started really promoting women in high power positions, where they could be like, there's a Marilyn Monroe movie. I don't remember the name of it offhand.
Woman Like It's Hot.
I think that's what it is. And there was like a woman in like a fashion magazine. She was like a CEO, high powered, in New York and whatnot. And then, so it's kind of getting these folks kind of used to and familiar with, oh, well, I can step outside of the home. I can do these high powered work positions and whatnot, which again, from an individual basis, I don't see anything wrong with that at all, obviously. And then in the 1960s, of course, you have the hippie movement. And then you have in the 70s with kind of the women's lib movement. And so a lot of those folks, kind of sidebar comment, who were in that original movement, who are like the baby boomer generation, the problem is they haven't changed their political viewpoints since that time period. So it's very archaic. They still think the Democratic Party of yesteryear, that was of JFK and the poor and helping the working man and whatnot, is still the Democratic Party of today. And this is what they're slowly but surely waking up to realize is, whoa, wait a minute, there's been a radical progressive left that's infiltrated their way in to the Democratic Party and taken it over. It's not what it used to be. And trying to get people to realize that is like pulling teeth, because they're so adherent to their prior belief system. So you have this kind of bent that's growing. And then in the 80s, there were a lot of movies and a lot of this movement, like 95, for example, was a really good movie that kind of represented this. And actually, there was a podcast where we were talking about how that movie kind of kicked off all of these kind of workers' rights and kind of women being treated more fairly in the workplace. Again, all good things. But the point is that there's this kind of breaking away from traditional norms. That's where I'm going with this. And this is what you see is like modern versus postmodern movements that are taking place. So over time, women have gotten used to this idea of being more independent, more fierce, more masculine, more empowered and embrazened, which again, to a certain degree is a good thing, but to an extreme is now where we're starting to get into the Karen conversation. And that's where I'm going with all of this. So that's kind of one history lesson in terms of an arc of how did we get here.
Yeah, especially when they had the broken homes and stuff that we talked about, and now it's, the two job, two income type of household and things. So now the women can, just take care of themselves, and they feel that, why don't I just move the guys over and just handle the whole thing type attitude,
And that's kind of another piece here as well, is that they had to get women out of the household. So how do they do that? Well, you have to have this arc that I just went through describing in order to indirectly get them out of the household. And then you have to put economic pressure, like started in the 60s and then definitely the 70s in the Carter era and beyond. Even Nixon, was involved with this, but Reagan really kind of upped the ante in terms of taxes and fees and kind of getting rid of the middle class and this illusion of trickle down economics and all those sorts of inflation, And so very quickly, it went from 1950s and early 60s, like Renaissance after World War II of really America booming, to now there's so many taxes and inflation and other things going on that in order to keep a home, you have to have a 2-household income. And so which the whole point of the engineering is then to have children being raised by the state, whether that's through corporate media on television, or it's through state-funded programs through schools. So people are having less bandwidth on top of it because they're so burned out from work. So there's kind of another psychological component. So now with Karen's here, what's happened is that how do we go next? I think as we kind of continue with the funnel, I think the next real piece here is pursuing certain values. And so everything was crafted in such a way during the Trump era that these people were taught in it, because it doesn't take very long to propagandize someone. There's research back in the 50s in Canada showing that all it takes is 2 months of a consistent message for you to be permanently brainwashed, almost permanently.
Wow.
So not long. So what do we have? We have 90% of our media controlled by 5 corporations that all were on the same page. And there's clear evidence of this even before the election, that these top tier media personnel went to fundraisers for Hillary and signed documents basically saying that they would do whatever they could to support her. So there's no such thing as fair and balanced media nowadays. It's all corporate based. That's how they pursue the agenda. That's this real strong arm of the deep state. This is why Trump said the media is the enemy of the people. And I would add to that, the number one enemy of the people. So with this, it didn't take very long for all this kind of powder keg of these people kind of feeling more embrazened and really excited to kind of have someone else kind of come into, like, that's where Hillary kind of came into play, right? That you have this presented as a strong female independent woman. And so all of these feminists were like, yes, I can't wait to have finally a female president. I don't care about her past. I don't care about what she represents or anything in terms of what she would bring to the table. She says nice flowery words, and she has a you-know-what in terms of a sexual organ. And those are really the only criteria I want. And so especially if these women were educated with college and beyond, clearly what we see and what we've talked about before on the show is that almost all of our educational institutions are now heavily, if not almost entirely, liberal leaning. And by liberal, I mean not in the traditional sense as a classic liberal, but I mean in terms of like Marxist liberal. And that's and crank the ante over time.
It would be nowadays it'd be considered neoliberal.
Yes, right.
Neoliberalism is in many cases the corruption of classical liberalism, as it believes in total freedom for all. But the caveat is that while you have freedom for all, it means that there is going to be equity versus equality. And the difference between equity and equality is the difference between everybody having a fair start versus a fair finish. Mm-hmm. And you want, in most successful communities, it's better to have everybody start in equal footing versus everyone having equal outcomes, because it depends on a person's drive and input into things versus their final result.
Yeah, a lot of them have the attitude of that, if you poured orange juice for 2 different ladies, one was kind of Karen-y, even if she finds in half of a fraction of a centimeter that you have more orange juice in that glass than she does, she's going to go nuts.
Yep. And
it's just because they want this even equal glass of, juice attitude. And it's the same with life. Everything has to be this fair and balanced, where it has to look wonderful in their eyes. If something doesn't look right for them, it doesn't feel right for them, it doesn't matter if it makes sense or not, you're going to get it.
And another thing, word there, which is feel. It's all emotion driven.
Another thing, I know we were going over the different years and things like that. Another year, a decade I think was very interesting is the 20s, the Roaring 20s, with the introduction of the flapper movement in the subculture. This idea of a woman allowed to reveal, heaven forbid, their thighs, their ankles for the first time ever. This idea of sexual liberation is because at the time before that, it was considered unfound for a woman to have anything below, I think it was her ankles. They were always top to bottom covered, and it was usually very modest looking. So now you have women with very what we considered a standard dress nowadays, and usually was a smaller hat on there with like a feather and stuff like that. This idea of this liberation, like, oh my gosh, men are out to war, or this is just a one fantastic time and I can just be myself without this patriarchy, deal with it, which I think eventually into 100 years later has kind of created this sense of almost misandry that's kind of been going around these days.
Well,
So-
yeah, they had to do this kind of equality in the women, and look at some of the products that they had out there in the 40s and the 50s. And one of the thing is razors. Razors originally were for the men to shave their face, as well as maybe a few other parts, but it was mostly for the men. And then the companies that made them and sold them, they said, well, we need to find a way to kind of incorporate women into the sales of it. What do? They introduced shaving of legs and armpits. There was no such thing back then until they brought that up, and then became a thing. There was not only for the sales to up the sales on razors and thing, but it was also kind of this free empowerment thing that, they could actually show their legs by starting to wear stocking if your legs have been shaved. So it's and kind of interesting though, because even when stockings came out, some women kind of felt that was still constricted. So they invented this pasty paint thing that they rubbed on their legs to make it look like they were wearing stockings, but here they still wanted to show their legs. And that's why the skirts got shorter to the point where they were knee length, And this is also was incorporated in the uniforms when the women were able to serve in the military. So as you can see how they had a lot of this stuff, and you can see how it is when they became stewardess for airplanes and things like that. The flight
Like Pan
attendants and
Am,
stuff. Yeah,
You're talking like Pan Am, American
yeah,
Airlines.
exactly.
Yep.
But it turned bad. It really turned bad back then, because it like Pan Am, then there was a lot of the sexual harassment. They basically had to smile and put up with men slapping their bums and things like that, on the flights and whatever. And they just had to put up with that for quite a while until a movement came out, and that integrated along with the yes, I can type movement as well. That, that you are allowed to stick up for yourself. You're not allowed, you don't have to just sit there and put up being an object to serve the men,
Right.
and that kind of pushed into what we have today is the modern Karen attitude.
Exactly.
Another thing, also when you're talking about the 50s, 40s, 50s, is that's when you start dealing with the beginnings of family planning as well. And you have the origins of the pill. That I think that was around the 50s was when the pill started coming around. And that's also when you started introducing things like sexual education and other forms of gendered education. I believe that's where actually that term of that type of liberal arts actually started being introduced, was in the early 50s.
And that's actually for our viewers to understand that on the spiritual side of the line, we have what's called cords, and these cords can be invisible unless you can see it with your third eye. But here, the bad guys, what they do, the deep states, what they do is they give you the sense that we are giving you freedom. We're letting you go out further. We're letting you do more. But they put this cord around you, and all they're doing is lengthening the leash, but you're still on a leash. And all these movements that they put out there in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, all they did was lengthen the leash, but the women were always still on a leash, and that's what the agenda hits in for.
Mhm.
So they think they're getting freedom. Kind of like how our parents do it. They give us these freedom, they lengthen the curfew, but you still got a curfew. That's the kind of the point of it.
I remember in the early 1900s, when you would go to the beach, like Coney Island, for example, there would be monitors who would go around with a tape measure and measure how long your dress is. And if your swimsuit / dress is shorter than a certain ratio, then you'd get a fine.
Mhm.
And my family actually invented the first modern bathing suit. And so it kind of broke the barriers of what it meant to just have this basically wet blanket that you were wearing of wool, which is awful when you're in water.
Yeah, it's heavy.
Exactly. So I think part of this trajectory that I'm trying to articulate here is that you're having women given more freedom so that they're more on the equal playing field, which again is good. But the problem is the way that Trump was framed was this capitalist pig, this narcissistic a-hole, this kind of just the stench of human existence, all represented in him and his personality. And so I think for a lot of these women, they became more emboldened because it didn't stop just during the election, that it continued on, and if anything, grew with momentum, because there was something else propelling this social engineering to continue on. And you had all these people essentially conceptualized from how the media framed things, that we were going backwards and not forwards, that you have good versus evil. Evil is now in the White House. And so then you have politicians, for example, like Maxine Waters, that get out there and say, it's okay to be violent. It's okay to kind of, right, if you don't like them and they're in a restaurant, you stand up and you say something, which is illegal for her to say that, kind of inciting violence as a member of Congress. But of course, did anything happen? No, right? And so you have all of these people. And then, of course, this is where the think tanks continue to come in, right? In terms of like weaponry, that now they're like 17 says, it's a war for your minds. We are in a world war, make no bones about it, but it's a mental war. It's not fought with bullets and blood in the streets. It's fought with propaganda and messaging of how information is being cultivated and packaged, of what information is out there and made publicly available, of what information is being censored with YouTube videos being taken down, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's what's being fought now. And it started during the Trump era, and it's continued with the C-19 era and all of the ouchies that are now being kind of passed on with all of their other iterations, et cetera. So with the Karen piece,
war of the mind.
Yes, exactly. It's a war of the mind. That's right. Yeah. And a war on consciousness. And there's so many different layers to kind of all of that.
Yeah, and the stuff that they put in the needles now, that's helping.
Yeah, exactly.
Their fuel, their agenda.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And
really,
yeah, go ahead.
No, I kind of find it interesting how, going back to, the hippies of the 60s, and then you had the grunge punk counterculture of the 90s, and how it's like, screw the government, you can't tell me what to do. Right. And all of a sudden now it's listen to the government, they know what they're doing, trust the government.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is very poisonous.
Which is funny because it's funny because the kids that are the kids and adults that are doing that now were either raised or grew up in those eras.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
They become the enemy that they have claimed to fight.
Well, and the irony here, of course, is how this has turned into doublespeak. That liberal means open-minded, that it's based on freedom and independence. And yet now you have the essentially liberal party spewing this message of extremity and backwards authoritarianism, which is you either believe in 100% of what we're dictating to you and conform, or else you are no longer one of us. And we'll throw every sling and arrow in your direction. Mm-hmm. And so that in a backwards way is then forcing people to wake up, because it's like, well, wait a minute here. That's not a message of love and compassion and all of these things that supposedly the left cares for and values. This is just repackaged neo-Nazism. And so, of course, as soon as you say fascism or Nazism or all these sorts of things, then they have their own conceptualization from how the information has been packaged to them of what that means. And that's been dubbed and rebranded as, no, that's a conservative thing. That's a Trump thing. That's a, the Republican thing, right? That you're just fat cat, white people, and you love big oil and big tech, and you're, these nasty human beings. And the Democrats are these embracing and loving and open-minded people of all races and genders and colors, etc. And, that's how they want people to think, in those black and white terms. And then when the details come out of, it's not that simple, then, as we talked about before, like this leads folks, if they're willing enough to even entertain that idea, leads them to feeling cognitive dissonance, which is very uncomfortable to feel.
Can can I actually share a personal example about that?
Yeah,
That's actually kind of funny you mentioned. I was like, I wonder if he's going to mention conservative eventually. I was like, that's going to be very interesting. But yeah, because I know I've mentioned this before. I'm actually a Republican committeeman in town, and I've actually talked to people who are staunch, liberal Democrat, and the first thing they say is, "What is your party?"
Mhm.
Right? If you
Right.
talk to anybody who's conservative, they're usually the question is not what is your party, but what are your what do you stand on? What are your morals? What is your platform?
Yeah.
Once you say, "Oh, Republican," and this is not just me that have had this happen. I know many other people have had that same thing. It all of a sudden becomes an us versus them situation, and it's not a how can we help each other as a community versus how are we different. But usually, what happens is you fall into that cognitive dissonance.
Mhm.
And now we're just saying, oh, well, you support Trump, or you're anti-mask, you're anti-vax, you're anti-science, you're anti, global warming, you don't believe in climate change, you hit all the isms, and it's like, did I say that? I have yet to say a single thing whatsoever, and yet you're claiming all those things about me. No, I believe that a lot of corporations are corrupt because of the fact that they deal with tax loopholes. I mean, have we ever looked at things like the Panama Papers and other things like that?
Right.
Big tech, I mean, do we even have to talk about big tech? I mean, look at how many liberal or democratic leaning celebrities have had their accounts banned on big tech. How many? Virtually none. Conservative, on the other hand, I mean, you have thousands of personalities that have had their accounts taken down. Many of them from the alternate media, many of them from the mainstream media. I mean, we had just the other day, Dr. What's his name? Dr. What's his name? From Boston. He's from Boston. He's running against Dr. Shiva. He was just questioning. He's like, I will debate Dr. Fauci and members of the healthcare community to deal with the validations of the current medical zeitgeist.
Mhm.
And what happened? Twitter deleted his account
Oh,
because
really?
he challenged the establishment.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, that's not exactly. That's not.
that's
That's
the
not
attitude.
exactly.
As soon as they determine what side you're on, they're actually like, shh, little,
And then,
yeah, quiet.
and then,
You're not one
and
of
then,
us.
and then,
No.
was it? I think it was either last night or the night prior. Ron Paul and the Ron Paul Institute's YouTube page got terminated without any strikes, without any warning, without any reason whatsoever. And that's because of if you know Ron Paul, he is a very strong I wouldn't say anti-establishment. He is a staunch libertarian, conservative libertarian. Anti-corruption, anti-Fed, just common sense. A lot of what he says is very common sense. But all right, sidebar's over.
Yeah. All valid points,
Yeah.
And so I think to kind of continue on here, that the social engineering then realized they had to encourage and whip up their base of these left-leaning individuals who have, classes based on women's studies and essentially like repackaged Marxism and socialism without using that terminology. Or if you did use that terminology, it would be incorrectly taught from all of these other authors and very different from the actual intentions of socialism or real tenets that have clearly been spelled out from like Lenin and others kind of at the core
Lenin,
when it started.
Trotsky, Walensky.
Exactly. That's right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the lead up. And so then during the Trump era, you have all of these people now out of nowhere, and I saw it massively in Portland, believe me, of where they just felt as though evil won. And as a result, all hands on deck, and essentially I can do whatever I want, because if evil wins in this country, then it doesn't matter anymore what I do. So I can do anything, and there's no limitations to that. And so, for example, I would see videos of people in downtown Portland, and they would just walk in the middle of an intersection, and they would stop and put their hand out, and they'd say, "This road is now closed." And there would be people at the light trying to go around him, be like, "What's going on?" And he's like, they were, part of Antifa, and they're just like, "This road is now closed." And so the drivers would then be forced to kind of go around as kind of more of their followers came out and further blocked the street of like, okay. And so they didn't want to get into some sort of violence. And so they ended up turning right and going around and finding a different way. And so you have this lawlessness and anarchy that's being carried out. And so to some degree, on a smaller scale, you see that with the Karen attitude of like, I'm embrazened, and it doesn't matter what your viewpoint of me is. I'm angry, and I have righteous indignation to my anger, because I am seeing injustice, at least how I subjectively interpret it. And so I'm going to go after you with my sword of truth. And what was the phrase that's going around? Speak truth to power. And so this is where you have, let me talk to your manager type of attitude. But it's not just in a customer service type setting. It's in all facets of life, So like Sue and I were talking about last night, that I don't remember where this was. I don't know if you do, Sue, but like that woman who was recording video, and she had a flag, and she was talking about America. And then all of a sudden the neighbor came out and said, "Yeah, we had a meeting about you recently. And like, we don't like this flag. It's a racist flag. And we don't like that t-shirt that you're wearing." And what else did she say, Sue? Do you remember?
That was actually it for that. And, she turned the camera back on to show her face expression. She was looking like, "Have you had a meeting about me?" Okay. Like, it was just weird. It was just almost random and out of place. Yeah. And we even had, it's just that because of the empowerment movement, we have a lot of them feel that they have this entitlement attitude, is to put it, like, and it almost kind of gets them in a policing mode. Right. Like they would come up to your car and knock on your window and roll it down, and you're like, what do you want? The driver's like, what? And she's like, "You're not wearing a mask," or something like that. "You're not wearing your face diaper." And it's like, "I'm in a car though. I'm in my car. What? And we have all this, Karen's coming out and constantly doing that in grocery stores. Where's your face diaper? Where's your, cards? Where's your, to prove that you got the needle job done, and it's just, it's constant stuff. And some of them is getting brutal to where the point that they would even involve the children. They would start yelling at, the person's kid and stuff like that. And it was almost abusive, and even I didn't want, any of my kids to kind of get like grocery store PTSD, but it's if it keeps up, it's going to come to that. Yeah. So it's just that, and it's hard to go around them and walk away from them because they follow you and nag you. And it's like, where's the law where I can just turn around and slug them, when you can't? So it's just that, they have this property ownership. They're getting now to the point of policing, but now they're also getting to the property ownership attitude, like what you were saying, hey, road closed attitude. But they will say, and they're getting more territorial. And if they decide that this seating belongs to them, this parking space belongs to them, and things like that, even though their names are not on it. And so it's like the mainstream, and I think a lot of the TikTok videos are encouraging it too. And it's almost like as if it's a contest to see if they can up the ante of their power, because in my opinion, it appears they're getting worse. Because in the old days, the Karens were actually a lot nicer. They were, "Can I speak to the manager?" And it was a nice tone. Right. Then, the manager would come and they would deal with their problems politely, and it would be resolved very quickly, very simply. And that's the end of it. There was no nasty tone of voice. There was no screaming. There was no yelling. There was no real entitlement. It was more of, "I have a problem. Let's solve this here. Something's not right. Something doesn't make sense," or something like that. But nowadays I've been seeing these, Karens, especially like in a McDonald's, I saw where they were the ice cream machine wouldn't work, and he's like, I want my ice cream and I want it now. Well, if they don't have it, all the screaming in the world's not going to get that ice cream anyway.
Yeah.
So it's just this. I mean, I don't know. It's almost like, lady, take a Prozac kind of feel, or something.
Yeah. But what's
And
happening? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. So another thing that's kind of interesting is this idea of what they were talking about in the university as well, is this idea of democracy versus public, and how in the cities, in the ancient Greek city-states, I believe it was Athens particularly, they had this thing called ostracism, and what would happen if a person would be ostracized basically is that you would have all the voters in Athens come to an amphitheater or whatever agreed location they would do, and they would throw stones into a pot. And what would happen is that the person who had the most stones voted to them would be exiled from Athens. Very much how it's this idea of, oh, we had this meeting about you, and we have all decided to ostracize you from this consensus of us.
We're voting you off the island.
Yeah, basically, it's reality show becoming a reality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they've gotten the Karens in such a condition, and it's maybe something you also want to talk about, is how we got them conditioned to have a problem with the American flag, because from when I was growing up, that we pledged allegiance to it, and now they've gotten away with that, and now they don't like the American flag, obviously, Orange Man bad, and I mean, they've literally gotten them to hate everything that you're supposed to love about being here.
Yeah.
So that actually, I think majority of that has to do with the encouragement of hedonism, actually, more than anything. The idea of, we're going to deal with the physical, we're going to deal with the pleasures of the body versus the pleasures of the mind and the spirit. We're going to oppose everything that is considered righteous or good, such as flags, such as a properly governed populace versus a corrupt one. And we're also going to deal with those family values. Like we have several teachers who are either currently under investigation or have been fired due to the fact of, they have literally used TikTok videos and other forms of social media, said, oh, I'm going to start corrupting my children, the children I'm under, by teaching them, Marxist ideologies or pledging allegiance to the LGBT flag, because I don't have an American one, even though the one was clearly in the closet.
Yeah. So as you were saying, Dr. Bloom, about the Karens kind of running their ideas on other people.
So I think you were mentioning earlier about communication, how they've gotten more violent, and I wanted to touch on that. So back, I think, to this kind of the trajectory and the timeline, that they started off being, again, very broad generalizations, women being more passive, being more docile, traditional gender norms of being in the home and being the parent who kind of helps rear the child while the father's kind of away working, etc., to then this kind of empowerment and having them be more emboldened of being an equal and being more assertive and having their voice count, which again is good. But what's the poison underneath? The poison underneath is then having the pendulum swing to now them being not assertive anymore and equal, but aggressive, kind of taking charge and taking stance. Now it's our turn. And you see that even in the BLM movement as well. Now it's our turn. We're going to make you pay for all those hundreds of years, whether that be through reparations or through, all this kind of condemnation, that you are entitled and essentially a bad person because you were born white. There's a book out talking about the racist baby, of how even when you're born, you can be racist. So it's this kind of intrinsic piece which of course is racist itself, right? Racist ideology, that because of this color of your skin, we're going to make global determinations about who you are. So this poor little innocent child who happens to have not very much melanin in their skin is now intrinsically entitled, going to have all of these stereotypical viewpoints toward others, etc. And so there's a great homework exercise for people to look into if they haven't done so yet. Research the Stanford prison experiment back in the 1970s with Zimbardo, who was the main researcher of this. And essentially what this study was looking at is college students who were playing these various roles of being either a prison guard or an inmate. And those who were in the prison guard experiment, within just a few days, things got extremely radical, where over time, very quickly, they became more emboldened, more entitled, and ultimately more violent, to the point that they actually had to stop the research study prematurely because it was getting too out of hand and it was becoming unethical because of the degree of violence. So you're seeing that psychology, that mindset now being played out on the world stage. And it's not just in America where Karens exist, they're all over. And a great example of this is, let's go back to the NAZI playbook, right? I mean, a lot of this, is we've talked about before on the show, is kind of that playbook being carried out all over again, just here in America in 2021. So look at for example, the flag for Antifa, and research its origins and how it pertains to that fascist administration. My point with that is that back then it was kind of narking on people who were trying to protect Jews, for example. And you'd have neighbors narking on neighbors, or other people kind of calling out and going to the state and saying, hey, these people aren't following orders. I'm going to be a Karen and kind of call them out. Or, for other things, why didn't you Heil Hitler in that last, meeting that we had, or where's your Nazi flag, or whatever, So this is a psychology and a mindset that's been present for quite a while. Or you go to Italy and you see the stereotypical old woman, or in Russia or Spain where I lived, and you'd have all these old women who were total Karens before that even became a trope. So this is a very kind of old mindset that's just kind of recreating itself out now in this kind of stereotypical way, that at least we have a name for. That's the power of memes, is that within not even a few years, even less than that, all of a sudden just these ideas come out of nowhere. They just pop up almost overnight, and it becomes like a household term within a few weeks, to the point that I saw, what was that politician you were just mentioning, Alex, that had his YouTube account canceled?
Oh, are you talking about Ron Paul?
Ron Paul. So Ron Paul's son.
Rand Paul.
Rand Paul, yes, thank you. That's it.
The senator of Kentucky.
Kentucky, yes. So Rand Paul was listening to an interview with him, and he even mentioned the word Karen the other day, which kind of made me chuckle, because I'm like, wow, even here these kind of politicians are using kind of colloquial phrasing in this way. And anyway, so I think part of what's scary about this, whether if it's Karens or Carls, or just kind of those that are just so emotion driven, especially on the left, is that they engage in a practice, a defense mechanism called projection. And that gets very dangerous, because projection involves the individual not taking any ownership over their feelings or any responsibility over their mindset or issues or struggles that they're dealing with, that it becomes so difficult for them to hold emotional and mental space in their psyche for all of that, that the only recourse that they have to deal with this is to project it and push it off onto another person. So they're not angry, they don't have problems, it's all now being projected onto other people. And it's an offload very quickly, where all of that steam gets let off and they kind of come back down to baseline. But you see this kind of whipping into a frenzy the past 4 years, to the point that, like, this concept of like TDS, right? That Trump derangement syndrome, where people literally become unhinged and deranged because there's so much emotion that even if you try to have a logical debate, as all of us have had, of like, let's create a distinction here between Trump's personality and his policies, as an example. And you can't have a conversation about his policies, because if you don't adhere strictly to all of this particular ideology of Trump is Satan reincarnate, etc., then you must be a racist, conservative, Trump-loving, backwaters freakazoid who needs to be placed in the category of like conspiracy theorist and the deep state and all these sorts of things, and so it becomes very black and white, and of course indirectly judgmental. And that's of course what they're trying to do, right? It's like what the 17 movement was all about, is recognizing in part that it's division that they're after, because it's less than 1% of these people that are really in charge. And I heard an interesting statistic last night, and they said if you rounded up all of the top tier sociopaths and the people that are in charge of businesses and government NGOs and behind the scenes cabal members, et cetera, that you could all put them in Wembley Stadium, which seats about 65,000 people. So think about that. That's less than 1% of the population, significantly less than 1%. And yet all of them are masterminding and puppeteering the 99+% of us. And that's what they're scared about, because the only Achilles heel for them is us waking up. And they never thought that that would happen. And the internet is the best example in terms of how we have woken up. They used the internet originally with the intention of trying to further cripple us in terms of monitoring and censorship and being able to track things like, through social media, right? And kind of the story behind how Facebook got started with, what was it called?
DARPA.
LifeLog. Through
LifeLog,
DARPA.
yep.
Yeah.
The DARPA, what's funny about the internet is there's an expression, which is that the internet was the DARPA project that got away.
Yeah.
Because the fact that it was supposed to control, and yet it is done the exact opposite of what it was intended to do.
Yeah. One of the most powerful memes that I've ever seen is this picture of all of these people hunched over. And
I know what you're talking about, yes.
Yeah.
And
they kind of all look like table legs and everything,
right.
kind of weave together.
Yep.
Yeah.
And there's a board game on top of their backs as they're kind of hunched over. And it's all these kind of fat cats kind of sitting around. And the caption reads something along the lines of, "It's only when we wake up that their game is over."
Yeah, we just simply stand up and it's done.
It's done. Yeah. That's right.
There's
happening.
That actually one that's kind of similar to that, and it's another meme, and it's like one of those 3-stage memes where there's one photo, then another photo, then another photo, and you have a group of people and they're all bowing down to a guy on the other end with a whip, and the second panel is 2 people standing up, and the whip still being lashed, and then eventually what happens is that everybody stands up, and then the guy with the whip's like, "Oh, who am I supposed to whip?"
That's a good one.
Yeah, and he ends up being the one bowing.
So. Yes. Yep.
So yeah. So here's another question I have. Is there a psychological reason why that there are more Karens than Carls? Because it seems like that, when it came to like this new policy of theft in the stores, I've seen more videos of men doing that. As long as you steal under $1,000, you're good to go. Go for it. Yeah. And I don't see so much as Karen's doing. I'm not saying they're not. I've seen more of them coming at the table and people who eat outside and start getting all cranky with them and start pouring their drinks on their head or spilling the food in their laps and things like that. I see more of them doing the females doing that, but the males are doing the stealing. Is there a psychological reason why it plays out this way and why there are more female Karens? And do you want to take those two?
So here's what I would say. Again, we're just hypothesizing in terms of different theories. So let's start with kind of brain anatomy. As we talked about last night, women's brains are structured differently than the male brain. And so the limbic system, which is in the center of the brain where emotion is processed, it's almost twice as large in women. And so, the stereotype about how women are so much more emotional or, all those kind of related types of stereotypes, part of that's based in truth, just from an anatomical point of view. So I'll come back to the reason why that's important in a minute. Now we'll take another data point, which I'll incorporate later, which is, let's talk about suicide for a quick second, that men are much more likely to die by suicide in much more violent means. They're also much more likely to die by more violent means. Why is that? Because they have testosterone and they're much more likely to take chances and risks that are much more violent based or adrenaline based, right? And so where that kind of fits in is this makes sense then in terms of why men would be much more likely to risk shoplifting and doing things where there's real action that's taken that's technically illegal. Whereas women are going to be much more passive aggressive, where the emotion really ramps up and they'll get mad and they'll yell and do their Karen episode, or they'll take a drink and pour it on someone's head. But you're not as likely statistically to see as many of them partake in much more violent related acts. So, for example, like if we were to look at like Antifa and the population ratio of male to female, well, it probably would get more complicated than that, because chances are you'd have, you know where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
So, I would argue that there's going to be a higher male ratio to female of those kind of partaking in acts of violence. So that's kind of that piece. And then there was something else that you asked, and I'm blanking on it, what it was, because I was going to make a mention.
Well, well, we just touched on, why they would steal and why they would not, but why are there just simply more of the female versus the males?
Yes. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier with my whole point of the historical bent of kind of women slowly and increasingly given more empowerment, that at this point, I think the pendulum is slowly swinging from them having an equal voice and empowerment and being assertive to them kind of being frothing at the mouth, to the point of then having that transition from assertiveness into aggressiveness. Mm-hmm. And so you saw that kind of encouraged, like we talked about earlier today, of kind of during the Trump era, and them being emboldened and encouraged to stand up, truth to power. And, to some degree, this is, and I want to talk kind of about the spiritual component next, that this is something that the Me Too movement, of course, was a great example of this as well, right? And there is toxic masculinity. There is such a thing as that. There is such a thing as a patriarchal hierarchy that's unhealthy. But where is the distinction between that and then here we are once again to sugarcoating and poison, right? That yes, those things exist, but sometimes that can be used to the point that now there's a war on masculinity in general. And there's a propaganda reason in terms of why that's being carried out from a communist point of view, of that you have to weaken those who are most in that masculine role. So that's done through food, through additives and hormones that are in food. That's done through various forms of the ouchies that are going around, not the one related to C19, but the ones you get at birth and when you're a child. That there's this war in terms of having men be men. And so now you see it, of course, with kind of the social engineering through like the LGBT movement, as it's now being infiltrated into schools. That somehow if you are a traditional gender norm or traditional norms, regardless of what subject we're discussing, that's now seen as inferior, old hat, something of the past that needs to be reformed. That's the whole idea behind the progressive movement, And so with that, I guess my point with all of this is that you have kind of women now coming from the standpoint of taking the charge to say, we're going to lead us onward. And that if you're not with us, you're against us. And so you have a lot of Karens now kind of standing up and talking amongst themselves and working together. And they're saying, now's our moment to kind of take charge and take over. And yet the Carls are still there, but I just don't see it as much as kind of the Karens in terms of that. But what's been your experience? Have you seen a lot of Carls, or has it been mostly Karens?
I've seen mostly Karens, and I find it interesting that basically every Karen video that you can possibly get your hands on TikTok, they're alone in the video.
Oh.
There's not their significant other staying there going, yep, she's telling you not to go down the street, or she's telling you to wear your face diaper. Yep, you ought to listen to her. You ought to listen to my woman, or something like that. There's
Yeah.
none of that. I have not seen. There's usually her by herself. There's a pretty good chance that she has a significant other. He's not going to be in this video with her, helping her yell at this human being.
Right.
And he's probably at work. She's doing this while he's at work, or whatever, or if she's, she's the only one that goes to the grocery store. So if she's going to check and make sure everybody's got the card, got the face diaper and everything, whatever it takes, and it's just interesting. So what do you think of that? Why isn't a Carl standing next and helping her fight for her side of the opinion or anything? I've noticed that it's just her.
Well,
And if there's a Carl, then he's by himself too.
I think part of it is that when there's a power dynamic in relationships, right? So like the traditional phrase that we say, like, who wears the pants in the relationship? So I would argue dollar to donuts that all of these Karens are going to be with very emasculated men, kind of wimpy, pussy whipped, whatever phrase we want to put there. In terms
Beta?
Yeah, betas. Good. Exactly. Yeah. So they're not going to show up in those types of videos. Only the alpha would be by her side or be encouraging her, And
I've also noticed that Karens are more willing to commit a tort versus a Carl as well.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not familiar with a tort, it's actually a legal term, which basically is any form of damage or an injury of some type. So, for example, verbal assault is considered a tort, or doing or stealing is considered a tort. But what I'm trying to get to this is that since Karens have become so emboldened over the course of time, they feel that they are immune or the exception to the rules of the law. Right. And so they're going to commit these things because they're like, oh, it's not going to affect me as much as anything else. And so they have this sense of self-entitlement of this versus Carl, which is actually going to be opposed by Karens, because Karens would think that's a lesser being in that aspect. You are a patriarch. You are a member of the patriarchy, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Because we see a pattern of that in the event of the January 6th, we found more Carls in that particular instance versus Karens, and that was supposed to, be a self-entitlement event, which of course, was all staged, but still, I'm just saying, why did we find more Carls on that day?
Well, it's the difference between what is the battleground, if you will. Probably not the best word, but it's the surrounding, the environment. Mm-hmm. A Carl is going to be more active within a physical-based environment versus a Karen, which is going to be more based on a mental and psychological one. Mm-hmm. So a Carl is going to be more happy to punch you in the face, quote unquote, punch a Nazi, if you will, with that mindset, versus a Karen who's going to say, well, you're a horrible person. This is the reason why you.
Yep.
Yeah.
You got it. That's it.
You
can't tell me,
Yeah. So that was, this is really good. And it's a good thing to learn all of this, to where all of this comes from, because it's easy to come up with all these videos and film them and tape them and, make fun of them and stuff. But, let's be serious about this. There's, this is actually starting to become its own poopy-demic, if you will.
Yeah.
It's actually starting to become that. And it's something that, that needs to take a step back and say, why are you doing this? Is this really going to change the planet? Is this really going to, are you just simply ruining somebody's day? Do you have a problem today? Did you not drink your coffee? Is there something, more external or internal going on that's making you be that way? Yeah. So, in my opinion, from a psychological point of view, I just think that step back is needed to be done for these sort of things.
Right.
Well,
The
I think
problem is because they're engaging in projection, they're not doing that stepping back process. That's
Right.
what so
Um,
But even I would just want even the people that, that aren't, and we all have a little bit of Karen and Carlos in us. I mean, we, if we, order food at a restaurant and, it didn't come out the way we want it, we do say something, but there's no reason to be a B word or an A word about it though, so, but yeah, it's all this stuff is conditioned throughout history to get to these points. And here's the interesting thing. The bad guys have been patient. They had the time to play out these programs, but now things are changing. And so it's rapid. So all their behaviors, their responses to things, whatever goes on in life is going to have to be rapid. Their propaganda responses will now have to be rapid. They're on their own timeline and a wavelength, but it's quick now. They didn't have this, the next 9 to 10 years to play this out, because if we did, then things wouldn't get noticed. When you play it quickly, you notice there's things going on.
that's right.
So so watching the Karens and the Carlos, now we have an idea of how they're evolved and how they got to these point A to point B thing. So what do you suggest for people who approach these types? How should they handle their day with them? Approach them, and if you get approached in the store, you get approached on your doorstep by neighbors who had a meeting about you and stuff like that. What would your recommendation be the best way to handle them?
Well, I think the first thing here is to recognize that they're in their own world and that there's nothing you could do to change them, because it's not able to change them. So oftentimes when I'm working with clients, I introduce like an Alex skill, if you will, or I call it the 50-50. And you imagine as though there's an invisible line that separates you from the other person. And anything behind that line is now dubbed your 50. And you are 100% responsible for your thoughts, your emotions, what actions that you take, all of your intentions, all of that's yours to own. But guess what? The other 50 that's theirs, same thing. They are 100% responsible for their half, their 50, their thoughts and emotions and actions and whatnot. And oftentimes they accuse the other person of gaslighting when in reality, they are the ones gaslighting. So how we use this skill is to respect the line. That's what it's all about. Boundary setting, right? It's a conceptual or mentally visual way to create this distinction between, okay, where is my half and where does that end? And then where's theirs begin, So that's kind of one idea, just as a broader concept to keep in mind as it pertains to people in general, to everybody. Now, the other thing that I really want to mention here is how we haven't touched on this yet, the spiritual component of everything that's going on. That from an energetic point of view, we're going through a massive purging right now on Earth. And so as a result of that purging, you have to have the dark, the shadow, the negativity come up to the surface for it to be healed. So for example, in the therapy space, oftentimes, and I tell my clients this kind of in the beginning, that you will likely feel worse before you start feeling better. And you see that statistically when you start to rank like symptoms on like a checklist when clients fill it out, that in the beginning few phases, few sessions, that their symptoms actually, they mark more distress. Well, why is that? Because they're actually having to look at the things that they've buried. And that's very uncomfortable to do. That's why we have coping tools in different ways to as defense mechanisms to avoid dealing with the muck that comes with being a human. And so having to look at this is step one. And then step two is then purging it by healing it, transforming it, alchemizing it to get it out so that it's no longer something that's plaguing us. And so that process that's going on in the intrapsychic level is a parallel process to what's happening globally. That we're having to look at all of the muck that's been hidden for thousands of years, the child trafficking, the list goes on in terms of all the different things that are out there. And so all of that's coming to the surface. And it's taking the form of this mass chaos in all of the different ways. And I would even argue it's a spiritual battle of good versus evil, of Satan versus God, you know, that before I wouldn't have said that. I thought, oh no, it's metaphorical. Now I see it, you know, this is very real. And so all of this negativity is kind of working through these people. And so it's really not their fault. Everyone, in my opinion, is always doing their best to come at life, doing the best that they can, given their awareness, knowledge, and skills. And if someone is at a lower state of consciousness and is screaming at you because, you know, you're not wearing a mask in your own car with the windows rolled up, then it says something about their 50, about their paradigm, about their low informed information and where they're coming from. That's all emotion based, that it's about fear, you know? And there's a great YouTube channel I recommend, and the guy's name is Steve Turley, and he gives commentary every day about just kind of what's going on in the world. Extremely articulate, highly recommend him. And he did a video today where he was talking about Stephen Colbert and how he had done this skit of dancing to the ouchie, and they had this kind of big production that was like musical.
Saw that.
Right. And it flopped big time. And so he was commenting about how there is a leftist psychiatrist that was commenting on this type of humor, with Colbert just being an example. But this type of, like, you know, you see it in like the late nights now, and like everyone has become so TDS that's like nothing's funny anymore. And for the true comedians, they don't even want to perform anymore. Like recently, Jerry Seinfeld come out and said he's no longer going to ever perform at a college campus anymore. Why? Because everything's become so extremely PC that you can't even joke. You can't even have humor anymore. And that's what you see in kind of this socialist movement, that there's such an overemphasis placed on equality and safe space, and not having anything that's going to disrupt or make me feel uncomfortable because everyone's feeling so fragile.
So now we're calling it the bubble wrap era, pretty much.
Yeah. There's actually a great video on this. There was a Democratic Socialist meeting. Alex, you might have seen this. And they were, I don't know, giving order, and they were commenting to their.
You're talking about what's it called? Can I have a moment of public privilege?
Yep.
That one.
Yes.
One person.
Their constituents is comrades, which that was very telling. But yeah, that's the video. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think one person was basically saying to keep quiet because they deal with extreme anxiety.
Right.
And then the second person went up and said, "Do not use gendered language."
Yeah.
And you basically have the person who is kind of the leader of this meeting.
Yeah.
And they're trying to deal with this issue, and they really can't, because the problem with equality is that everybody is equal at that point. There is no one can be superior to the other in any case whatsoever.
Yeah.
There is no winner.
Mm-hmm.
Because if there's a winner, then there's an inequality.
Yep, exactly.
And that they conditioned that actually through giving participation medals and ribbons and stuff like that. That was absolutely annoying when my oldest daughter was part of a science fair. And science fair is nothing like what it used to be in the old days. And the old days, it was like you were responsible for the project. The project looked like it was done by the parent, and that's what won first place. And I actually found that annoying. Mm-hmm. You know, it looked like the kid may have just helped paint it something or whatever. But, you know, all the writing, the handwriting, the wordings and everything was all done by the parent, and you can tell. Wow. And so it was, you know, so this inequality thing. And I'm going to tell you right now, my favorite comedians are the ones who are brassy. Mm-hmm. Those are the ones that, you know, have no boundaries or open their mouths and no joke about absolutely everything from
Right.
race to sex to anything. And it's those are my favorite ones because when they joke around, they're actually telling the truth.
Yeah.
And I'll give you
Yeah.
my favorite example, you know, George Carlin, you know.
Oh, I
Yeah.
love George Carlin.
Yeah.
George Carlin's
Yeah.
hilarious.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he's funny, but he has a big mouth and he's, you
Yep.
know, has a thing. What I find interesting though, to point out that Colbert dancing with all the ouchies and stuff, it was kind of funny that you can look it up, but the video was Trump dancing with the chickens, you know,
Yes.
doing this
Yeah.
whole the chicken
Right.
you know, chicken fingers, whatever, you know, type of dancing. That actually racked up way more views and way more likes
Oh yeah.
than a stupid ouchie
No.
dance. So, you know, that tells you something right there.
You know, what's funny about the Karens is that their biggest, their hubris in this is themselves, actually.
Oh yeah.
They have become their own hubris. And one of the, I know this may not be really connected, but this is something that I find very interesting, is I've been watching a lot of videos as of late about relationships, and you know, there's this adage I just keep on finding, and within these like TikTok videos or these short videos, and the term that is used is, where is the good men? That seems to be the thing. And I run into people, like one of them was called Undead Chronic, another one's Ribbity, another man is named Hammerhand, and they're basically, what they do is they ridicule, on which we don't really like people when they ridicule, but they're basically pointing out the glaring hubris and the glaring flaw in all these things that are going out.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, like the idea of hookup culture, which is becoming very common nowadays, versus the idea of the family. You know, there has to be a responsibility within relationships and all these other things. And you're like, why is there no good people, good men? It's because you have basically thought that you are a better person, and you think that they're nothing more than a lesser being than you. You know.
And with this trigger culture that we live in, everyone is turning into a Karen. That's the social engineering piece, you see. And even back to comedians, even with that, it's so touchy nowadays. Our society, it's like a giant powder keg, because they're trying to promote civil war, of course, right? And so what used to be funny now isn't funny because it would be offensive to a certain population. So this psychiatrist that Turley was mentioning today, I'll read the quote. It said, the humor that's being expressed by these comedians and whatnot, like Colbert, is unhealthy humor. The humor you are describing is defensive in nature. It's defending against anxiety and fear. Specifically, it is a defensive use of contempt. Through it, people can demean and insult Donald Trump, which in turn means they don't have to be afraid of him. One of the ways a person can express contempt is through laughter. Thus, it is a denial of one's vulnerability, because contempt means the other person is harmless. Therefore, he or she cannot hurt you. In that way, Trump is made into a pathetic fool. Quote, if I laugh, it's not going to hurt me. So again, this is where they like scoff, you know, the whole idea of scoffing. It's trying to minimize what's going on. So Turley's commentary was saying that behind this feigned humor that we're seeing in like these late night comics is really a huge degree of fear. Even in a post-Trump era, their humor remains the same. Everyone knows on some level their spidey senses going off that things aren't adding up as it pertains to Biden. And now, I won't say the word, but in recent events that took place in Arizona, it's creating a huge domino effect now with the AUDIT. And so that's going to have a lot of repercussions that I'm very anxious to see. So I have my popcorn ready.
Yeah.
Well, it's not just in I think, is that not just Arizona that we're saying this, but we're also seeing this in the Peach State as well, and we're also seeing this in many states in the Rust Belt in the Midwest.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, they're like, "Oh, we can get away with something, and you can do nothing about it." And like, wait a minute, what are you doing? Don't do that. Don't do that. Why are you doing that? Don't do that. Oh, you actually have the footage. What? How did you find that person? Oh, wait a minute. You have a forensic person who understands security logs. Oh no, now you can actually read the metadata, and this becomes this. After this point, you're like this. It's the sociopath basically laughing hysterically because since they can't actually express emotion properly, they are at that point imploding mentally.
Think about the Joker.
Yeah, you had that, the crazy laugh, if you will, the person where they are so hysterically crazy that that's how they're basically losing their mind. Like, I had this plan and it was perfect, and you've somehow foiled it.
Yeah.
It's the nervous laugh on steroids, basically.
A good term to look up is histrionic personality disorder. And the histrionic kind of has such extreme expression of emotion that it comes across as so feigned or fake that it's off-putting.
Like Kamala Harris.
Yeah, all
oh my God, her laugh is kind of hyena-y now.
Histrionic. I actually have the definition of it too.
Good.
It's the characteristic of acting or a stage performance, often affected. So another word would be being melodramatic.
Yep. Yeah. And you see this in so many like it's gone to the extreme that I can't even listen to the drip drab coming out of a lot of these politicians' mouths. It's so fake. Adam Schiff and what's that other gal? I can't remember her name.
Which one?
She's a senator, and she looks like she would be Indian. I'll have to look it up. But
senator?
Yeah.
I'm pretty good. I'm pretty good at these names. That one's not ringing a bell right now. Indian.
Yeah, she's dark skinned, and she's got big eyes. Her mouth kind of goes inward. Very homely looking. She's older. Let's see. I'm looking on Google Images here to see if I can pick her out real quick. She was just on TV today talking about something. Shoot. Anyway, the point is that there are some of these people who are just so extreme in that way that any sane person who's listening to this knows that what they're discussing and how they're coming across is very fake.
Are you talking about that wouldn't be no, never mind. That's a representative. Never mind.
Let me see. Let's go to on YouTube looking up MSNBC, maybe. She was just on today talking about C-19 and just things that are going on there, of how basically she's protecting Biden's approach with mandates in businesses.
Let's see. I actually got my list of senators.
Okay.
So I'm just going to quick. Woman, you said?
I don't know what state she was in.
Let's say.
But she also gave commentary. What was this for? They were interviewing. Oh, this was after the January riot. She was one of the outspoken senators during that time period as well. She's one of those that it just rubs you the wrong way when you.
No, I don't see. No, I don't see a senator that actually matches that.
Oh, okay.
There might be a representative.
Might be. It might be.
Because when I think of that, I'm thinking like Rashida Tlaib, maybe Omar, maybe.
Now, what memoir? It was someone that's probably part of this progressive left. Is
Squad,
older.
part of this. What was it? CNBC, you said?
MSNBC or CNBC, one of those.
I'm actually curious now, but anyways.
I know. Yeah, well, we can. I'll look
Yeah,
it up.
you guys will be up
we'll-
all night until this one gets solved.
Anyways, it's gonna be one of those things where you wake up at 3 a.m. and you're like, now I remember.
Yeah, especially when you wake up to go to the loo.
Exactly. Exactly.
But anyways, I know, but you're talking about how the TDS somehow, how Orange Man's gone, and all of a sudden, you would think that we would go back to normalcy of this post-Trump era, and yet no, it's actually intensified in some bizarre way. Like it's almost like a Frankenstein's monster, if you will. Mm-hmm. And it's just going through the village at this point. It's destroying everything because it was something that they could yield on a leash, and then all of a sudden that leash broke.
Right. That's right.
Oh,
So
yeah. Well, I mean, they're trying to. This is a way they can get their army geared up,
Mm-hmm.
I knew it was a representative.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
I don't know how to pronounce your name.
Let me see.
But I want to go back to Sue's question. What else we can do when we're interacting with the Karens? And I think this is where we have to kind of adopt our own spiritual practice, that with this 50-50, that from a spiritual point of view now, which is transcending psychological point of views, that the other person is an extension or a projection of ourself.
Yes.
When you have someone who's so outlandish with their anger and whatnot, and that triggers us, the spiritual question for us comes back to, what is it in what I'm seeing as an illusion out there, as an extension of me, that's triggering something on the inside that needs some attention or healing? And so from that point of view, we don't focus as much on the other person's 50 because, or to conceptualize it differently, they could be what are those called? The background players, you know what I'm saying?
The NPCs?
The non-players.
Yeah,
it's the NPCs.
But it's a term that Dolores Cannon.
NP or NP something.
Yeah, non-playable character. That's the NPC, but this is background characters or background players or something along those lines. And she referenced this idea that those people might not even be real people. It might be AI. They might not even have a soul. They might kind of come around for a short period of time where they are meant to interact and interface with us on some level, and then they kind of transition out. And so from a spiritual point of view with those Karens, it's about us kind of staying in charge. Once again, as it always is, spiritually, it's about us maintaining as much ownership as possible over our vibration.
Okay.
So when we get triggered and spun out because they're being, what's toward us, that it's a call for us to come back to our 50 and take further ownership. Because if we slip and lose our sense of empowerment because they're triggering us and get our vibe kind of off whack, then they win. That's exactly what they want. They want us to get them underneath our skin. And so when we don't react, that's the biggest. Look at the what was the kiddo's name in Washington D.C. that wore the Trump hat during the rally, and there was
Nick Sandman.
That's the one,
Nick
right?
Sandman.
Sandman. Yeah.
Right now,
Sandman.
What happened when you watch the video? Right, you have the Native American coming up, banging on the drum, and kind of yelling at him and everything. And what does he do? He just stands there. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't react. And they smeared him. They went after him. They called him the smirker, remember? And all of that sort of stuff. And he just sat in his empowerment, taking ownership of his 50 and saying, you can come up, you can yell, you can bang your drums, you can do whatever you want to do. And I'm not going to play your game and react. Because if I react, I'm on the same level of consciousness as you are. And I'm not going to play that game. And so what happens? They up the ante even more. Then you get the media involved. Then you get all these lies being spread. And then what happens? He maintained his cool the entire time. And what happened in the end? He's worth millions now, hundreds of millions. We don't even know the full amount. It could be 250 million that he's worth, just an ungodly amount that's going to eventually break the back of the media. And Trump's doing the same thing, right? This is where you have someone that's granted narcissistic, yes, granted thick-skinned. I mean, he's a New Yorker. He's from Manhattan, no less. And you
don't mentally or verbally run over a New Yorker,
Exactly. And not only that, like a high-powered billionaire New Yorker.
Right.
Like you got to have thick skin, especially when you're dealing with the mafia and all those kinds of characters that he's dealt with for decades, So hats off to him for being in that dog-eat-dog world, That said, he also has a real strength to him because of that. Most of us, I would argue, the vast majority of us, probably including myself, would have cracked on some level with the degree of pressure from the media and the lies and the spin and everything that had been going on, not just up to the election, but even after he got elected, And so as a result, what happened? You never saw him lose his cool. You saw him kind of joking and mocking the media and kind of setting them up with his own traps to what's the word I'm looking for? Troll the media, right? And then what happens? They fall for it every time, because they don't understand the humor. That's the NPC part, right? That he'll sit there and he'll say something egregious that's so over the top that if you watch the video, he's being sarcastic. And the media will just splash that headline of Trump says this now, to where it's laughable, right? But my point is he maintained his sense of centeredness, his sense of empowerment. And that's the invitation. That's the call for all of us to do, especially when we're faced with the own Karens in our lives. I see it the most, ironically enough, from Carl's when they are stewardesses on airplanes.
Yeah.
And boy, do they really get in everyone's face in terms of, I saw it just on this last flight coming home from Florida, where they really kind of up the ante in terms of taking on this like fascist viewpoint of like, we have full control when we're in the skies. And if we need to arrest you or do whatever we need to do, you will adhere to us, which is, of course, the same psychology and mindset of the left right now, that you will obey, you will do what we say. And the sad part is they're all just emotionally driven puppets from what the cabal wants to do. And obviously they own both sides, right? That the rhino Republicans are no better than these Democrats that are just unhinged and not representative of what the party used to represent. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. Bloom.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I think, what's that?
Go ahead.
No, Sue, go ahead. What's your thoughts?
Oh, I was going to say actually that I thought that would be a good place to stick a pin in, and
I was just about to say the same exact thing. I think we have come to a natural conclusion to this conversation, and I think this is a good time to put a what's it called? A lid on this, if you will. And yes. So anyway.
So
anything,
so
last
thank
thoughts or
you.
anything?
Thank you both, Alex. I appreciate your insights. It was absolutely amazing to dig into this topic. So thank you very much, both of you.
It's an interesting subject and a very sadly relevant one for all of us.
Yeah, I agree. Very, very relevant and also necessary to understand in order to properly navigate the modern day psyche.
Yeah.
So I would like to thank Katie, and I would like to, Soma Fusion, and I would like, thank especially iEvolveTV. And let's see, Saavi, closing line, if you guys want to feel comfy and awesome and everything and relaxed, as well as be able to do your workout without feeling like you're stretching into a Gumby, Saavi closing line. And, we'll see you guys next week.
Have a good one.